Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having us here today. So we met Alan. He came to one of our tours, and we want to thank him for inviting us to the meeting today. We host those tours and we do presentations like this to help spread the mission of Imagine. And Imagine's mission is to support children and families coping with loss and to foster resiliency and emotional well-being for all those who grieve. So we offer free year-round grief support for children and families, and also grief education in the community. We started in a church basement in Westfield, and now almost 10 years later, we have 2 sites, one in Mountainside and one in Newark. And we will be celebrating our 10-year anniversary starting in this fall. So in October, we will be around for 10 years, really just trying to help children and families who are experiencing a loss. So today, we want to get started by actually introducing our founder, Mary Robinson. So Mary is actually on a well-deserved sabbatical right now, but she recorded just a little introduction to Imagine and why it came to be, which we're going to share with you today, because who better to tell you than the person that founded it. So I'm going to share my screen. It's Mary.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you to all of you for taking an hour out of your day to come and be with us and learn about Imagine and our mission and programs. One of the reasons we do these tours is to make sure everybody in the community knows about us as a free resource for children and families coping with loss. And we also do them because it allows us to live our mission of education and advocacy on behalf of grieving children. So thank you so much for being here. When I was 14, my father died of cancer. I was a freshman at Madison High School. My brother was a sophomore, and we did terribly after our dad died. My brother got involved with drinking and drugs. He ended up dropping out of school his senior year. On my end, I started to not do well in school. My grades went down. I started skipping school. I quit all my school activities and ended up getting quite depressed into my 20s. And I share that with you because my brother and I were textbook examples of grieving kids. We were expressing our internal distress and sadness and fear over the loss of our dad through our behavior. Fortunately for us, we had an extraordinarily resilient mom. She, even though she had just lost her best friend and the love of her life, figured out how to get a job and pay everybody we owed money to. When my dad was diagnosed with cancer, he had just changed jobs, so we had no medical insurance, and we were really wiped out financially. This is not uncommon in families where a parent dies. There's also a lot of secondary losses, like financial distress or having to move. In our case, our mom had been a stay-at-home mom and then was working 24/7 in the field of real estate to try to keep us on our feet. And she did an amazing job and paid everybody back, made my life possible, sent me on to college. So she's definitely my hero. But again, my brother and I did not do well. So one of the reasons I do this work is to make sure other kids don't lose years of their life to unaddressed grief, because it's not necessary. Back then, over 40 years ago, they didn't know in the schools that when a child has a loss, that it's our job as the adults in their lives to pay attention, to provide support and resources, to listen and show up and help kids tell their story and share their feelings. So Imagine exists as an effective intervention and prevention program for kids coping with loss due to death or illness. We provide peer support groups for over 450 children and parents every 2 weeks at our centers in Mountainside and Newark. We are a peer support model. Our groups are facilitated by trained adult volunteers from the community. And the reason this is possible is because grief is not pathological. Grief is a normal, natural response to loss. And that's why really anyone who has the capacity to listen and some of their own resilience can support a grieving child. So we are a community-based model and a family model. The whole family comes together to imagine, to participate in peer support groups. So when Nicole introduced me, she said, I am the founder, and I am the founder, but I want to let you know I didn't dream up this model. This model of children's grief support has been around for close to 40 years. The first children's grief support center started in Portland, Oregon in the early 80s. It's called the Dougie Center, and it was named after a little boy named Dougie Turnow. He was very sick. He was in the pediatric oncology unit at a medical center in Portland, Oregon. Terribly sick. He actually was in communication with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who, for those of you who may not know, was really a guru in the field of death and dying back then. She worked with dying patients. She wrote prolifically on the topic. And Dougie got to write her a letter where he basically said, Dear Elizabeth, why are adults so weird? How come none of them are talking about what's going on with us? I want to talk about it. I want to know if I'm ever going to get to kiss a girl or ever going to get to drive a car. I want to talk, and so do the other kids. We know we're terribly sick. I know I'm probably going to die, but nobody's talking about it. So he inspired his nurse and social worker to start running support groups out of their living rooms for families with very ill children. Over time, as some of the children died, they realized they had to run bereavement support groups. And by then it had outgrown their living rooms, and they ended up incorporating as a nonprofit and named it after Dougie Turnow, this little boy who had inspired them and taught them that children need a safe place and they need to talk and share their feelings. And what I love about this, because there's been a whole movement of children's grief support centers since then. There's over 500 centers like Imagine and like the Dougie Center. They ended up on the show 2020, a couple years after starting their center, and got calls from around the country, over hundreds of calls, from communities like ours wanting to know how they could create a center like that because they knew there was a desperate need in their community. So I love that this whole movement of children's grief support was inspired by a child whose wisdom taught the adults in his life what kids need. So we are able to serve over 450 children and adults every 2 weeks because of the amazing volunteers from the community. Volunteers come from all walks of life. We have close to 100 adult and teen volunteers who facilitate our support groups. The thing about grief is it's not pathological. It's a normal, natural response to loss. And that's why people from the community can support grieving kids. You don't need a clinical background. You don't need to be a therapist. You just need the ability to be present to kids and adults in pain and have some of your own resiliency and the ability to create a safe space. So the volunteer part of our program is really the foundation of the work that we do. We wouldn't exist without our wonderful volunteers. In addition to the peer support groups that we run at our center in Mountainside and Newark, we do a ton of education in the community. And that's because we want to make sure that wherever a child turns in their life, that there's an adult or a peer who's been exposed to our workshops or tours or trainings, and they understand that when a child has a loss, that we have to show up and pay attention. We have to find resources for them. We have to let them know that their loss matters and that we're there to listen to them and support them and to help them express their feelings. It was a number of years after my dad died that my mom said to me one day, she said, I must have told the story of your dad's death to Carlin in the living room over 100 times. And Carlin was her best friend. And that's when I realized my brother and I never got to tell our story, which is an essential part of mourning and of dealing with grief in our lives. And that's what kids and adults and families get to do here at Imagine. So Imagine is really a labor of love for me. I want to make sure other kids don't lose years of their life to unaddressed grief, because it's not necessary if you get support. I really believe the world is driven by unaddressed grief. You walk into any 12-step meeting, any therapist's office, any psychiatric unit in any hospital or any prison, and you will hear nothing but stories of grief and loss. So we want to support kids at the time of their loss to make sure that they can cope with the current loss and develop healthy coping tools and grow more resilient, so that they can also then deal with any future losses in their lives.
All right. So that's a little bit from Mary about how and why Imagine started. And she talked a lot about the peer support that we do in our centers. But something else that's really important to Imagine and our mission is the grief education that we do in the community, both in businesses, schools, and community organizations. And Jamie, who is my colleague here with me today, she's our training manager, and she's going to give you guys just a little bit of a taste of what we cover in some of our trainings. So I'm going to turn it over to Jamie.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I'm just going to share my screen in a moment. So as Nicole mentioned, Imagine does provide free year-round grief support services to families that have experienced the death of a parent or a child. And when people reach out to Imagine, besides looking for support, people from the community ask many, many questions. They ask, what do I say to someone who has had a loss? What, excuse me. Let me reshare the screen. They want to know, what do I say to somebody who's had a loss? They want to know, is this the right thing to say? How do I support my coworker who's just had a death? And that is the reason why we created our grief education and trainings. So my name, as Nicole said, is Jamie Saltamachia. I am our training education manager. And what we do is we go out into the community, especially into schools where children are, but also to organizations like this to share our grief education, because we want our children to find support and supportive adults wherever they go. So that is a big reason why we do what we do and why I love doing this type of work. So when we think about grief, we typically think about loss due to death, right? That's pretty much the first thing that people think when they hear the word grief. But I want to challenge that a little bit today. And I want to give you a little bit of a taste of what our trainings are like. So this is kind of a very abbreviated version of the training that we do offer. So I'm wondering if anyone can share another kind of loss that they can think of. And you could do that in the chat. I can keep an eye on it, or you can say it.
Or raise your virtual hand and we'll unmute you.
Perfect, thank you.
Go ahead, everybody's welcome to be the first.
Putting you on the spot today.
Okay, Bill Tittle. Bill?
Yeah, you wouldn't know this, Jamie, but as you get older, you lose a step or two. And some of us are actually feeling memory loss. And that's a very scary thing. But the good news is that if it's not severe, you can manage it. You know, you write stuff down on lists rather than in the past you could just remember it and so forth. So that's what I'd like to share. That's a loss.
Absolutely, Bill. Thank you for sharing.
Ken Lindhorst, would you? Yes, you have unmuted. Okay, go ahead, Ken.
Thank you. I lost a child. Actually, he was 45 years old riding a motorcycle. He was hit and killed. And, you know, I really didn't have any support group.
Right.
That's about it.
Sorry to hear that, Ken. Thank you for sharing that with this group.
Ron Hoke, it's your turn.
I have two other suggestions. One, especially for some children, is losing a pet. Another one I think is more common, and that's moving. And all of your friends that you had grown up with, and feeling that, especially if you move into a new neighborhood and you're so alone, you know nobody, and you just feel like an outcast.
Absolutely. Great points.
It's also a comment in the chat about grief at the loss of a job, which is a good one as well.
These are all really great examples. And as Ron mentioned, the loss of a pet, that's oftentimes the first loss that children experience. And some parents, want to hide that. Some parents will go out and try to replace, the goldfish that passes away. But that makes it really difficult for children to learn how to handle loss at an early age. So that's something we generally discourage parents from doing. Did we have any other examples before I move on? Okay. So as Mary mentioned so beautifully in her video, whenever there's a loss, especially a loss due to death, there are ripple effects. So I want you to think of it like that, like the pebble going into the water and all the ripples that spread out. So there are things that come along with that, such as job loss, which was also mentioned. It could mean also moving, like Ron said. It could mean a parent who previously wasn't working, having to get a job. I'm sorry. I thought I missed something. It could also mean for kids sometimes having to change schools because they move. So there's all these ripple effects that come along with loss that we don't typically think of when people are grieving. So I just want to challenge us to think about that a little bit. And the other piece is in the last year and a half or so, we've had all these different kind of losses related to the pandemic and this experience that we call collective grief. Because for the first time, in at least my lifetime, we're all grieving together. Even if we haven't, we've been fortunate enough not to lose somebody to COVID, we've had to experience all these little losses that come together to create this collective loss. So things like businesses closing, things like losing the ability to grieve together, to have funerals and shivas and things like that. We've lost the ability for kids to go to school, to be with their peers, to celebrate really important life events. So that's been a really challenging part about this year. And whenever we have a loss, we have grief. So even if it's not a loss due to death, we still have the right to grieve and we have the right to claim those losses. So if you're seeing, an increase in depression, if you're seeing an increase in anxiety, those are very normal and natural responses. As Nicole said, we don't like to think as grief as pathological. We like to think of it as just a natural response to something that's really challenging that's happening in our lives. So I want us to also think about different types of loss. And I really appreciate when I asked you all to share a little bit about the different types of losses that you brought up. So there's this idea of ambiguous loss. And I can't remember who said it, but ironically, about memory loss. So sharing about how it's difficult to remember sometimes what you're doing from one moment to the next, and you might need a little reminder. That's an ambiguous loss because it's not like you lost the ability to remember, it just makes it a little challenging sometimes. Things like military deployment, if you have a parent who's in the military, they're, not physically present, but emotionally they're absent. They're not in your life on a day-to-day basis. Things like divorce. The parents hasn't died, but they're not in your life the same way that they once were. Or things like incarceration, same kind of situation. And also natural disasters, which we don't typically think of as a loss, but oftentimes that results in a loss of safety. So all of these are kind of ambiguous. They're a little bit hard to define, but they all are still very much losses. Another type of loss that I wanted to share about is this idea of disenfranchised loss or disenfranchised grief. So these are situations where society looks at that with a stigma, right? They don't like to talk about it. They don't like to acknowledge it. So in situations where there's a suicide death, oftentimes, it's like this hush hush, we're not going to say how the person died. or if there's an overdose. Unfortunately, because of the opioid crisis, especially in New Jersey, we've had a lot of overdose losses. And oftentimes the family doesn't want people to know that that's the cause of death because there's such a stigma attached to being an addict, even though being an addict is a disease. Things like homicide, and also things like miscarriages, especially with new moms. They don't feel the right to claim that loss. And another one that was mentioned is this idea of anticipatory loss or anticipatory grief. And this is a situation where you haven't had the experience of loss yet, but you know that that's coming. So in cases like terminal illness, somebody that has a cancer diagnosis, you know, the prognosis is pretty short, but it's still, you start the grieving process early because it's really hard to acknowledge and face either your own mortality or someone else's. And that's also the case with Alzheimer's and dementia. So these are just a couple of different types of losses that we like to share in our trainings to make people aware of. So another piece that we think is important is the idea of grief beliefs. And these are things that we get either from our family of origin, things that our parents told us growing up, things that we get from the media, things that we get from watching TV or movies. And it's all these ideas that we have in our head about what grief is and what grief isn't, or what it should be or shouldn't be. So I want to share a couple of them with you. And if you have others that you want to share, you can put them in the chat, or you could raise your hand and let us know. So I want you to think about when I present these, are they true? Are they untrue? Are they healthy? Or are they unhealthy? So this idea of other people have it worse. Does anybody have any thoughts about that? Is that a true or untrue one? Somebody says that to agree.
We don't have any responses so far.
That's okay.
Oh,
No,
here is one.
Sure.
Here is one. Alan Havison, would you like to chip in there?
I think we think that, and when we look around and we see where we are and we see what others don't have, we realize that it is worse. And while maybe not in every case, but certainly as we can look around as we're having a good steak dinner or the such, we realize that maybe we really don't have it as bad. So I'm one of those who tries and works hard at rationalizing that there are other people that have far more challenges than I do.
Right. That's a great point, Alan. Thank you so much for sharing. I think this one comes up a lot, especially with children. They like to compare, you know, well, my dad died when I was a little bit older, so it wasn't as difficult as you who lost your father when he was younger. Ron, did you want to share as well?
I think that's untrue. I don't think it's much of a comfort if you're suffering from a loss to realize that other people may have it worse than you do. I don't think that's much of a comfort at all. That really doesn't relieve you of what you're going through, the grief that you're experiencing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I want to think about this one. Time heals all wounds. What do we think? Is that a healthy and unhealthy thing? You think it's true, not true? Go ahead, Rich.
Unmute,
Well,
yes.
I think it's partially true, but I think it's unhealthy because the problem is now, not in the future. And while hopefully you will feel better in the future, the problem needs to be dealt with now.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Thank you for sharing. Okay. What about this one? Grief happens in stages. We hear this one all the time. What do you guys think? True or untrue? If you're familiar with the stages of grief, the denial, anger, bargaining. Go ahead, Alan.
I think that grief does happen in stages. We go through periods and where we have the loss of a friend, a family member, something, and it does come at different times in our lives. And, it all comes back to how you define some of these terms. And just going back, I'd like to just go back to where time heals all wounds. And I think to some extent it does. And the simplest example that I can relate to is that all of us at one time or another suffer pain. But after a while, we know we suffered the pain and we feel it, but no, we don't we feel the pain in our minds, but really not in our bodies. So there is some sense of healing and grief and sadness. I realize they're a part of life.
Right.
So that's my point.
Thank you, Alan. Paul, did you want to share as well? Oh, I think you're muted still.
Sorry. I would think that there might be certain types of grief and for certain people who actually keep feeling that grief a long time. So it's, sometimes these generalities, well, time heals all wounds, therefore we can ignore it. I think for some people that's not true, and they still have to learn to live with that grief rather than it just going away.
Right. Does grief ever go away? Do we ever stop grieving if somebody's gone?
In certain ways, no.
Yeah.
But in other ways, yes. And for certain people, no. That's what I'm saying. So it's not one size fits all, I think.
Absolutely. Great point. Griff, did you have something to share?
Yeah, I don't think at our age, time heals all wounds. The wounds tend to get worse. Within the last year and a half, I've started to have trouble with small strokes, and I'm afraid it's going to get worse. And I am getting all wound up with my life expectancy probably being half what I thought it was. So it's difficult when you get up into the high 70s and especially into your 80s.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Another one that comes up all the time is to deal with grief, you need to be strong. And I think everybody's going to experience grief at some point in their life, right? We're all going to have to face a loss or many losses in some cases. And I think saying, you need to be strong, especially to young boys and men, is very damaging, right? Herb, did you want to share something about that?
Herb, you can unmute. There you go.
Actually, I had a general comment. These are all adult issues. Your organization deals with children. And I recall when I was 13 and my father died, I had a strong family. I had 6 siblings and a wonderful mother and millions of cousins, aunts and uncles. And that all helps because in that community, I felt comfortable with my father's death. But with my schoolmates, I didn't know how to cope with it. I didn't know how to, you mentioned stigma. I felt kind of embarrassed because my father died. I don't have a father anymore. And that's not an adult feeling, that's a child feeling.
Yeah.
So you don't want to talk to an 8-year-old about, well, you can talk to them about being strong, and your mother, your father, your whatever, the source of your grief wants you to be strong and wants you to be good. The usual things we give children. But other people have it worse. That's like telling me, eat your food, because there are other children around the world who don't have food. Never bought that. Okay, that's my comments.
Thank you, Herb. I appreciate that. And I want to clarify, we are a Children's Grief Support Center, and all of these things that are on this list have been said to children. They come to our groups and they share that with us. Ron, did you have a comment?
Yes, I'd like to comment, especially on the last one, to deal with
Yeah.
grief, you need to be strong. I think that's very unhealthy and not helpful at all, because the people at this point need to have support. Telling them that they need to be strong is a way of putting more burden on them, because they're not going to necessarily feel strong. And if they don't feel strong, that makes them feel even worse, because they feel that they're not up to it. Other people are, but they're not. That just makes everything worse than it really should be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate you sharing. And I think, just to comment on that, we've had that said to a lot of young boys that come to Imagine who are 8, 9, 10 years old, and to say, you need to be strong. Does that mean I can't cry? Does that mean I can't be sad that my mom is gone? Absolutely not. But there is some validity, like some of you are saying, that like sometimes it makes you feel a little better because you need to step up and you need to support your siblings and things like that. So a lot of these are kind of a gray area, right? They're not necessarily right or wrong or healthy or unhealthy. It kind of depends on the situation. I see a couple more hands. Bill, did you want to comment? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah. Relative to this last point, you have to be strong. My instincts tell me that you need to deal with whatever you're feeling. But I know in my own case, sometimes I can wallow in sadness. And so for me, that makes me want to kick myself and go forward. So it's the balance between being accepting the feeling that you're feeling, but not wallowing in it. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. That's a good point. Like there's a certain point where, yes, you get to be sad, you get to have all of those feelings, but you also still have responsibilities, right? We can't not go to school forever, not go back to work for, 6 to 9 months. We eventually need to figure out a way forward. So I think is that what I'm hearing? Finding that balance? Okay. Great. So, I see one other hand up. Mitch, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. One of the things that hasn't been brought up, but I think is important, is the cultural issue. We all come from different cultural backgrounds. I'm at least partly Swedish. I'm a mutt, but I'm partially Swedish, and so we kind of tend to be a little stoic. I married a Catholic, and a lot of their wakes, at least back in the day, involved a hell of a lot of drinking of Irish whiskey. And other cultures, it's wailing and rending of the cloth, and a variety of different ways that we approach grief. But the point is that we have to be sensitive to the fact that your culture and my culture lead us to grieving in different particular ways. Internally, it might be more similar, but externally, you've I'm sure been to funerals where nobody cried, and then other ones where you can't hear the minister for all the wailing in the congregation. Anyway, that's the point.
Excellent point, Mitch. And to just elaborate on that a little bit, these are just some grief beliefs. We have hundreds of grief beliefs that come from places like our culture, from our background, from our parents, from our friends, things that we think are true or untrue about grief. So the point of all of this is just to say we need to be aware of the grief beliefs that we carry around and what we put on others, especially children, because children listen to the adults around them. And if an adult is telling them like, time heals all wounds, like you're going to be okay, just, trust that. It can be a difficult thing for a child to hear. So that's why we just want you to be aware of these things. And I love this quote at the bottom from Rabbi Earl Grolman. grief is not a disease, a disorder, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. So unfortunately, we can't avoid it, as hard as it is and as difficult and challenging it is to talk about. I'd imagine, love to talk about it. We call it the elephant in the room. That's why at our center, if you ever come visit, there's elephants everywhere. They're kind of like our mascot because, we want you to remember the person. We want to talk about that elephant in the room because where else are you going to do that? Somebody mentioned when they went back to school, they felt like the only one. A lot of times kids that come to Imagine are the only kid in their class who had a parent die. So they feel very isolated. So the more we talk about it, the better off our children and ourselves are going to be. So another quick activity that I want to do that I love to do in our trainings is to challenge you to think about what you want when you're grieving or when you have grieved. Everybody's different, right? We all have different reactions and things that we like, things that we really don't like. So I would love it if you could take a look at this list. And when you have a strong reaction to something, when you're like, yes, I love that. I love when people do that for me. Or when you're like, absolutely not, I hate that. I want you to raise your hand and share a little bit if you don't mind. You could also do that in the chat. Go ahead, Rich.
I was just reading down the list and I got to number 5, and I think that resonates with me. To have somebody talk about the person who has died and what that person did and their interaction, what that person meant to them, and it helps to affirm my feelings about the person and about the importance of the person, and recognize that this person made a difference. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I saw in the chat, Nicole agrees with that. She likes the story. Anyone else? Let's see Jim's hand. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing as Rich. I asked people to actually remembered about my wife when she died. Lisa's talked about the Christmas cookies that she used to make and how they always look forward to them. And just little things like that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. Wondering if anybody had a strong reaction in the opposite way, like they're like, I hate when people do that. I really dislike that. Can you raise your hand or you could share in the chat?
We have in the chat, Mitch said, never, they are in a better place now, and variants on that theme.
Yeah, we hear that one a lot. There's no better place for my loved one than right here with me. Where else could they possibly be?
Well, and just to amplify what I said in the chat, that invokes people in heaven with wings and sitting on a cloud and a bunch of things like that you may or may not believe, but shoving your beliefs on somebody else at that particular time is wrong. And also, I think it was Rich just mentioned that we need to talk, and we need to remember some of the good things about the person, a lot of the good things, all the good things, whatever. And also there are rituals. Every culture has them. We just saw in with the COVID in India, all these funeral pyres, which I don't get, I'm not in that culture. And the point is, if your culture demands a potluck lunch after the funeral, then respect that and have a potluck lunch. But the point is, we have to go through various rituals, some of which are grieving and emotional, and some of them are like, ordering death certificates, which is not exactly a grief process, but it's a ritual that somebody in the next kin's got to go through. So just respect the rituals, because they are important for people getting through this process, even though maybe you never get completely through it.
Thank you, Mitch. I appreciate you bringing it back to culture, because just like grief beliefs, a lot of these are informed by our culture and things that we're supposed to do. I see Arch's hand is up. Go ahead, Arch.
Yeah. I volunteer for Caring Contact on the crisis line. And
Wow.
so number 14 speaks to me, to have someone spend time listening to you. I understand the power of listening, of being heard. And that really hits me.
That's wonderful. And that's very important work that you do. So thank you for doing that.
Thanks.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, my mother died about 20 years ago, and I've got the usual flow of cards. And the one card that meant a lot to me, was called the Indian Prayer, which you can see online. And why it hit me so hard, which I still send to people when something happens, is it talks about the daily life. And as long as you think about that person, they're still alive with you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Taking a look in the chat, Howard said number 13 is awful. So having someone say everything happens for a reason sounds awful to Howard. I agree. Not a big fan of that one. Any other strong reactions that anyone wants to share? Any other thoughts about what they want when they're grieving, or anything that's not on this list? Because this is not an all-encompassing list.
I'll just chime in and say, part of what, if you're central to the grief, you're an immediate relative, there's a whole lot of stuff that's got to happen internally, externally. If you're peripheral, say a cousin or a neighbor, this is the time to step up and help these people through their grief process. And anything from bringing a potluck dish to taking care of some of the mechanicals, to canceling the newspaper, just a wide variety of things. And there's things we peripheral people cannot do, like help them with what's going on in their head, but we can certainly help them with other aspects of it. And, oh, by the way, all of us who are not yet dead, it's always nice to have detailed plans for what happens for your relatives, starting with, for instance, the password to your computer, and maybe writing an obituary. Anyway, point being, do your loved ones a favor, and don't burden them with a lot of crap, during the immediate period after you die.
Good point.
Crap, by the way, is an official technical term there.
Oh, got it. Perfect. I see two other hands, Paul and then Ron. Go ahead.
Yeah, it occurs to me that one of the problems is that a lot of people will say the same fairly trivial things to a person, and not even particularly mean it, because they're fairly casual acquaintances. So sort of how you say these things, I think, matters a whole lot. And if you're not that close to the person, probably saying less is better than saying more. And I'm sure this is what you do a lot in this counseling, but listening to them rather than you talking and saying these sort of standard things to them is probably better. And encouraging them to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes just creating a space for somebody to share is the best thing that you can do. Go ahead, Ron.
I think one thing that we should do and keep in mind, if we're trying to help somebody who's grieving, is to try the best we can to see things from their perspective. What do you think they need? What do you think you could do to help them that they would want you to do.
Right.
And I think it's well to understand that at a time like this, these people are needy. They need support. They need help. They need assistance, not only to do things that are tasks associated with this time of death of a person that's very close to them, but the emotional support that they need, and try to see things from their perspective, and do things that you think would help them in ways that you think that, depending upon who these people are and how well you know them, things that would be a comfort and a support to them.
Absolutely, Ron. And I'm so glad that you said that, because that's the point of this exercise. That's why we do this a lot, especially when we go into schools and seeing the differences in people's responses. So for example, like, I'm a hugger, I'm Italian. I'm going to reach out and hug you if you're sad, right? But if I see Nicole sad and she's crying and I go to hug her, but she's not a person who really likes to get hugged, that's just going to make her feel uncomfortable. And my intentions are good, right? I just want to comfort her, but I'm doing for her what I want done for me. So I love your point, Ron, about thinking about the other person and putting yourself in their shoes. I think that's an excellent point. I see two more hands. I see Herb and then Rich, and then I'll go on to the next slide.
You're waiting on me. I think 8 is a key to keep busy. It works very well with children. You get their mind on something different, and it helps pass that time until the wound heals. I know it worked very well with me when my wife died. A longtime business associate said, "Herb, you got to get back to work." And he was right. He got me busy, and it helped. But well, that's all I want to say. If you can keep people occupied, it keeps their mind off their loss, and it helps.
Thank you so much for sharing. Rich, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just a couple of things quickly. One is I second the idea that, you know, if you're not that close, if you're a neighbor, then yeah, maybe what you say at the time is, "I am so sorry for your loss," and then you let them talk. The other point I wanted to make is that what I want when I'm grieving might depend on how close I am to the event. You've got that, call it a week, right around when something happened, and the things you want, the things you need, may be different from 3 months later or a year later, when you're still going through a grieving process, but your wants and needs may change.
Absolutely. They can change moment to moment, day to day. They could change based on the person that's doing them for you. You know, even if you're a person who likes hugs, you might not want everybody to hug you, and that's okay. So I think that's an excellent point to add. So I want to move on very briefly. The biggest question that we get at Imagine is, what do I say? What is the right thing to say to somebody who is going through a loss? So these are some of the things that people tend to say. Something good will come out of this. I know how you feel. This is really hard. And time heals all wounds, which we heard already. So I'm wondering, out of these, what do you think is the most supportive thing to say of the 4 things on the screen? Any thoughts? And none of them are right or wrong, just some are more supportive and less supportive. Take a look at the chat. Yep, Howard got it. So this is really hard. Just sitting and acknowledging, like, I see that you're going through some pain right now. That can be a very empathic response. Or like Rich said, just keeping it simple, and I'm sorry for your loss. just acknowledging it. And I think Paul also shared, just giving them space to share what they need to share is super, super important. And that's the best gift that you can give somebody. A lot of the times after a loss, people want to say like, oh, I know how you feel. I lost my mom too. So they'll start sharing about how they felt when they lost, and it's completely different than how you feel. And it makes you feel a little bit less important. So I definitely encourage you to just have that empathic response, to just, state that you're sorry and to give that person the space. Because is there a perfect thing to say when you've had a loss or you've been grieving? Is there like one perfect thing somebody said to you that was like, yes, that was great? No, right? I'm seeing a lot of head shake. So there really isn't like a perfect thing to say. But Maya Angelou's quote that I love is, when we know better, we do better. So I love that quote, because the better we try to support others, the more we're going to learn. And that is why we do these types of training. So we just gave you a little bit of a taste, and I'm going to cut it off there and turn it back over to Nicole, because I know she has a couple things she wants to add. But thank you so much for that conversation. You all are experts on this subject, and I truly appreciate all of your participation today.
Whoops, I was still muted. Thank you, Jamie. So we're going to wrap up today with two things. First, I want to share one of our family participant stories. As we mentioned, prior to COVID, we were serving over 450 families every 2 weeks, and they all have their own story, right? They're all coming with their own experiences. So we're going to share just one of them with you today, just to give you an idea of who we see walk through our doors. Let me just find that here. All right, everyone see that screen?
Known each other since we were about 14, 15 years old. I actually asked him out on our first date. Fred was born to be a dad. I couldn't have chosen a more incredible person to be the father of my children.
My dad had this pack of notebooks that he let me use. So every time I used to cut out a little strip and I wrote down a message, and then Daddy would write back to me, and we used to do that all the time during work and stuff.
My husband on December 15th had an arterial dissection, and he was rushed to Trinitas Hospital in Elizabeth. His artery just completely opened up. One of the most heart-wrenching conversations, and it's come up in different forms since then. We were so happy. Why did Dad have to die? Are we getting punished, Mom?
Before I came to Imagine, my heart sunk all the way down to my foot, and then my heart started crushing into different pieces.
Walk into a building that you've never been in, and you see a lot of different faces, and here you are, with two little children, and you're wondering, okay, what is this? What are you going to expect? What are you going to feel like? I introduced myself and I said my name. My name is Suzanne. I'm 39 years old, and my husband died less than a month ago, and I could hear but then I can't even begin to describe it. I just started talking, and everyone listened. The second time that we came, my Lucy was really willing to hold the talking stick and say, hi, my name is Lucia, and I lost my dad.
I get to express my feelings with the other kids and share what's been difficult with me, and I get to share my emotions with my counselors.
And then by the third or fourth time, Raquel wanted to join in too, and oh, my daddy died. And I remember thinking, does she even really understand what she's saying? But they wanted to participate and be a part of it. You go into a room with a bunch of strangers and you're telling them about your loss, the person that you thought you were gonna grow old with, these other humans don't know you and you don't know them, and yet you're putting yourself completely out there. My girls would ask, are we going to Imagine? And sometimes they would ask on the Tuesday when we weren't coming here, and I'd be like, no, it's not this Tuesday, it's next Tuesday.
So this box is actually a special box that I actually can use if I want to like write messages to Daddy. I can just like write them in this like box right here with the hole in it. It's really fun to like write all these messages to Daddy, like how we used to do in his office.
So clearly within their groups, and even me as an adult, we were getting the stuff that we needed for, you know, emotional strength.
My heart is like starting to like rise up all the way where it belongs again. I know what that song is. Hey Jude. Hey Jude. Don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better. Remember to let them into.
All right. So that's just one of our stories. And what I love about what that family shared is that the importance of sharing their story. They talked a little bit about our opening circle ritual, and that's something that we do in the beginning of our nights of support. When we're in person, we're passing around a talking stick, and each family member is invited to, say who they are and name the person that's died. And we always say it's okay to pass at Imagine, because sometimes a child's not ready. You heard Suzanne saying that story that, one of her daughters wasn't ready until the second or third time, and the other one waited till the fourth or fifth time. But part of the magic of that opening ceremony is that they realize they're not alone. Like Jamie said, oftentimes in school, they could be the only person that's experiencing a loss like that. But here at Imagine, everyone there has experienced a death. And so being there and hearing that, they know they're not alone. They know it's okay to talk about death here and that their loss matters. And that's really important. Mary mentioned as well, when she was telling her story, that, her mom had said, oh, I told the story to Carlin a million times in the living room. And Mary realized she hadn't told her story. So the importance of that is, it can't be described. And that's really part of the magic of being a part of Imagine. So the last thing I want to share with you guys today before we open it up to questions is just a few different ways to get involved. So let me share that as well. Sorry about that. Here we go. So the first way that we always say, if you're interested in learning a little more about Imagine, is come for a tour. Right now, our tours are still virtual. In the fall, we'll be doing a hybrid, having some virtual and some in person. But through the summer, they're going to remain virtual. We offer them 3 times a month at different times, during the day, to try to accommodate different schedules. But I will say we also do private tours. So if there was a group interested in coming to see our site in Mountainside, we'd be happy to arrange a private tour for you guys as well. And then we have some trainings coming up. We have a loss and grief specialist training, which Jamie, I don't know, do you want to touch a little bit about what that is?
Sure, thanks, Nicole. So our loss and grief specialist training is a brand new training that we developed because a lot of people in the community were asking us, like, how do we respond after loss? A lot of people that work in schools and community organizations wanted to be that go-to person so that they don't even have to call Imagine. They just know exactly what to do. So that's exactly what this training is. It gives you a certification to be the person that responds when there's loss. We're going to give a ton of resources. We're going to go through a lot of scenarios, and we're going to teach all of the participants how to support grieving people. So that's the goal of that training.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I see Nolan has his hand raised.
Yeah. Hi. Great talk. And a 10-minute tape was like, I was going to put in the chat, wow. I mean, my God. A rhetorical question, and I think an overriding question, a general question. Is it not almost always better for an individual dealing with grief to let it out rather than to hold it in as an overarching sort of approach, whether you cry or you scream or you yell or you talk about it, rather than to just suck it up and bury it inside of you? It seems like, psychologically that's a huge dichotomy.
Absolutely. I mean, Jamie's the expert here, but my take is, I mean, that's why Imagine exists, to have a place to come and let those feelings out. We actually have a room. If you come on our tour, you'll see we have a room called the Volcano Room. And it's a small room, fully padded, where we allow 1 or 2 kids to go at a time. And they could punch pillows, they could stomp on bubble wrap and rip old phone books. And the idea is by releasing that kinetic energy in their body, because maybe what they want to do is scream and punch a pillow. If they're letting it out that way, the idea is it's going to let them express themselves also verbally better when they're back in their larger groups. So there are a lot of different ways to get it out, and our philosophy is to share and to let it out. Jamie, I don't know if you want to expand on that.
No, absolutely. You said exactly what I was going to say. So thank you for that point, Nolan. I appreciate it.
Paul?
Oh, yeah, I'd just like to point out that there's a lot of wonderful information on your website. Beautifully done website. One of the questions that came up when I was talking to some old guys about this session several weeks ago, somebody said, well, why is it called Imagine? What does that have to do with, it seemed pretty obvious to me why it was called Imagine, but I have to say, there's a perfect answer to that question on your website. I mean, if you want to try to paraphrase it right now, that would be fine, but I would refer you to that website.
Yes.
I would just like to also add on a personal note that I was at Christchurch when Mary Robinson started Good Grief, which was the first time she did this. This is Imagine, it's the second organization she started. And I was there, I was the tech support person. So I was there in the evenings and when they were running these programs. And I was just so impressed with the work that you all do and how I mean, you can tell how dedicated people are and how sensitive they are and how they know how to do this and they organize this whole thing, these events. I mean, it's just wonderful to see. And all of the people that came, it was very successful. So I just want to acknowledge you all for doing this work.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I do actually have a question after all of that.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about it, we just went through an extremely difficult year with COVID, and that meant you couldn't do a lot of your normal in-person things, so you had to adapt. And there's a story there, obviously, if you want to tell it. And then B, there was a whole lot more people grieving because of COVID, so you had to somehow adapt to that too.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I can take that one, Nicole.
Mm-hmm.
So we did have to change our model, right? Like because we were meeting in person and that was such an integral part of our program, we had to figure out how to translate that to the virtual world. None of us had ever really used Zoom except for the occasional meeting. So it was definitely a learning curve, but we transitioned all of our groups onto the Zoom format. All of the families come on and they go out into the breakout rooms. So they're all in their separate groups and we encourage them to be on separate devices in separate rooms, just like they would be during our normal groups. And we adopted all of our activities because we do an activity each night of support. So sometimes it's art-based, sometimes it's movement. And we translated those things so you could do yoga in your living room, or you could do an art project based on whatever you have in the house. So I will say it was definitely, like I said, a learning curve. It took a little bit of time to get people on board, but once they came on, we went from having one night of support, which is about 60 people total. We now have 4 full nights of support virtually. So in the fall, we're planning on using a hybrid model. So some of our groups will go back in person and some will continue online because it works for some people. So great question.
We actually had 82 new families since March of 2020. So there were a lot of people looking for support in this past year.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Al, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Nicole and Jamie, for a wonderful presentation. Is there a boundary between grief and depression? And what do you have to say to try to prevent people from going across that boundary?
That's a great question, Al. Well, in the mental health field, there's a term called complicated grief, and that is the symptoms of depression that are prolonged. So they're just not letting up, they're not getting any better, and they go on for 6 months or longer. So we don't like to diagnose somebody who's grieving with depression for at least a year after the loss. But depression is a normal response to grief. So it is something that we do see. But if you know somebody who's grieving, who's had a loss in the last year, and they seem to be exhibiting some signs of depression, it doesn't hurt to check in on them, to ask, have you talked to anybody, or have you tried to get some support, and encouraging them to do that. So good question.
Ron, did you have a question?
Yes, could you give us some idea of what people who may have younger children or younger grandchildren can anticipate going forward as a result of what these young children experienced during the year or so of COVID-19?
Absolutely. Another great question. And Connie, who is our clinical training director, and I have done full-scale trainings on what's a normal response for a child, and especially after this pandemic, what we can expect to see. But basically, any kinds of behavioral changes in your children or your grandchildren can be expected. So things like regressing. So a child who was very independent may become very clingy. You may see an increase in them crying. You may see an increase in them like wanting or looking for their parent or needing a little bit of extra support. So that's very generally what you can expect. But if that's something you're interested in, we do full scale, like I said, trainings on each developmental age and what to expect.
Mark, did you have a question?
Yes, this is Mark Edelman. It's 11:30. And if you don't mind, we will continue the questions for a few more minutes. Okay, that's all.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Everybody raise your hands if you have. There's Rich Smith.
It's excellent presentation, Nicole and Jamie. One comment, again, kind of close to home. My mom passed away last October. She'd been declining health. She passed away at 92. She had kidney disease plus dementia. So, I was thinking there's sort of a pre-grieving process for the family, and also I think for my mom, that, we knew she was in terminal illness, and we tried to make her as comfortable as possible, had friends visit, did FaceTime calls with her friends, and not, to have them say goodbye, but just to spend time with her and, know that people were thinking about her. So I guess, question, I guess, is you get ever involved really with, cases where they, it's a terminal situation with a parent, and so where do you go pre-grieving process, or is it always, once someone has passed away?
We actually used to have a coping with illness night of support. When we went virtual, we did not do the coping with illness program in our virtual program. However, I do think we plan to bring that back. It just was sort of on a hiatus with COVID, but we did have a program for that exact reason.
And I saw a question in the chat from Howard. When you see somebody who seems to need therapy in addition to group support, to whom do you refer them? So one option is Imagine. If they're not a good fit for our groups, like if they don't have a child who is of the age of our groups, we'll always refer them to someone else. We'll make sure that they find support. And in the chat, I'm going to put a couple of hotlines and things that you can also use. So I'll do that in the meantime.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bill, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wondered if you ever deal with the issue of guilt, because I can imagine that the kids, maybe they didn't have that good relationship with, and they feel the parent may have died because of them, or does that come up, and do you specifically deal with it?
Yeah, we say that grief are all the feelings that we have in our bodies after a loss, and one of them can be guilt, and one of them can be relief. You know, if someone's very ill and it's almost a relief to see that they're not in pain anymore. So there are a lot of different feelings that encompass grief, and we think the support that we offer at Imagine helps them all. Jamie, if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think guilt is something that we hear all the time, especially with young children who don't quite have the developmental understanding about death. They may think like, oh, I wasn't behaving. Is that why daddy died? Is it my fault? So that definitely comes up a lot. And that's something that we address in our trainings for the facilitators who run our groups, because we want them to be prepared. If those things do come up, we want them to say the right thing, right? So I know Nicole was kind of going over our training. So I just wanted to highlight that last bullet point on the slide. We have upcoming facilitator trainings. And that is basically a 3-day, very intensive training for volunteers who actually run our support group. So as we mentioned earlier, everything is run by volunteers at Imagine. Although we have a clinical staff, such as myself, we think that grief is a normal, natural response to death. So we don't need to be clinicians to run a support group. So that is those 2 training dates. If you know somebody who wants to be involved, or if you yourself want to be involved and become a facilitator, it is a very intensive training, and it is a 1-year commitment at minimum. And you could facilitate groups for as young as our purple, which is our 3 to 5-year-olds, all the way up to our gold group, which is a child loss group.
Wonderful. Alan?
I see that Roger has his hand up, and what we'll do is at this point, since it's getting later, let's you guys have another meeting after this. Roger, you ask your question, and then I'll come back on.
Yes, just a quick one. I noticed Mary was on a sabbatical, and I see Jamie is LSW. I have a daughter who's an LPC, teaches counsel behavioral health, and during doing so, often the counselors become overwhelmed with the situation. I'm just curious as to whether you periodically take a break, or how do you handle that?
I love that question, Roger, and I love that you're thinking about self-care, and especially in relation to your daughter. We go on vacation just like everybody else. It's really important to balance it. And I think Imagine as an organization really prioritizes mental health and, encourages us to take those days. And, if you're feeling, not great, not like yourself, you're not going to be able to support other people. So we're very mindful of that. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
And also for our facilitators, when you are a facilitator and you come to group every other week, the facilitators come before the participants come, and they stay after, because we have pre and post group, so that when they're coming, if they're carrying something from the day, they have the pre-group to express that and get that out. So when they're with the participants, they're really focused on their experience. And then we have post group, because sometimes the things that you hear in group can be heavy. So we want them to be able to express that as well, and talk in community with the other facilitators, so they're not carrying that with them for the rest of their week.
Okay, I want to, Nicole, Jamie, I have no words other than thank you for a very, very moving and great experience for not just me, but I'm sure for, and I can't speak for everyone, but for many of the members of the old guard. And one of the things that we've learned is the importance of not just talking, but listening, hearing, sharing, and feeling with understanding and compassion. And I guess now for a lot of us, and maybe more, and certainly more, the loss of our past feelings of entitled comforts because of the pandemic have changed and challenged. And we're looking forward to a new life at for some of us past 70, more of us like me past 80, and some even more. So we all have a lot of issues to deal with. And at least we know there's someone out there for those who have had, and I know that before in some of the comments about losses and the seriousness of them, and some people, I still believe some people do have it worse, but there's always someone to help you. Two things. One of the ways of showing our appreciation for your time and what you've told us, and you can see on the screen, these two gold certificates, orchid certificates. Many years ago, Summit was the orchid capital of the area, and we will be getting, I will be getting these certificates to you within the next few days. And I just say again, thank you. You will be hearing from me as you have more and more, and I have a bunch of other questions and things. So thank you for a very wonderful presentation. And the last is the Old Guard salute, which everybody raises their hand and claps.
Thank you. So
Thank
nice.
you, and have a wonderful, wonderful day, and all our best wishes for your continued success.
Thank you.
all.
Just a
Thank
quick
you so
comment,
much.
the link that Jamie sent for the About Imagine has the background story to why we're called Imagine. And then I just posted the link for our tours if anyone's interested. Thank you again.
Thank you
Thank
so much for
you.
having us.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Ellen, for hosting, and thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Jamie.